So this is the meadow, the famous Mountain Meadows, where this massacre occurred. Well, they had chained all their wagons together here. They'd dug trenches. And they'd shoveled dirt into their wagons, trying to protect themselves from the bullets that were flying. I mean, look, you got these little hills all around this little meadow. So anybody that's parked down here is a sitting duck. The moral of the story is, don't give up your guns. And that's what happened. The people from Arkansas, the wagon train, they were running out of ammunition. A number of their people had been killed. And the Mormons came down here and tried to make it sound as though it was the Indians that were after them. And if they would put down their weapons, they could protect them from the Indians. So they put down their weapons. The Mormons marched them over the hill, shot them all. Now, the last time that we were here was during the year that the Olympics were happening, and it was wintertime when we passed through here. And the Mormon church had been desperately trying to hide this bit of history from all the reporters that were coming in from all over the world. So people might ask, why is it that the Mormons hated the people from Arkansas so much? Well, there's a bit of history there. And we could probably take it all the way back to New York, where this whole thing started with Joseph Smith. I mean, Joseph Smith made a lot of enemies, and he had so many wild ideas that anytime he was confronted, there was a conflict. So they ran him out of New York, him and his followers. Then they end up in Ohio for a while. Then pressure builds there, and they get run out of town, basically. They end up in Nauvoo, Illinois for a few years. Then the locals, they begin to speak out against his polygamist ideas and some of his other ideas. And then eventually some of his comrades, and who knows who all was involved in it, they burn a printing press down that was owned by a guy that was printing some stuff exposing some of the problems with Mormonism. So Joseph Smith and a couple of his guys get locked up in the jail. Some other non-Mormons figure that he's not going to get prosecuted properly. They didn't think that there'd be justice brought, so they put it in their own hands, and they shot the guy. So after that, things got kind of tough, and they were looking for a new leader. So lo and behold, Brigham. Brigham was the most charismatic of Joseph Smith's followers, obviously, and so he rallied the troops. They took off to Salt Lake. Well, you might remember that Joseph Smith was a Freemason. So a lot of his ideas were influenced by Masonic ritual, and of course within Freemasonry back in those days they had blood oaths. If you shared any of the secrets of Freemasonry, you could get your throat cut. So some of those ideas spilled over into Mormonism. So when this wagon train came through Salt Lake from Arkansas, lo and behold, a few months earlier, back in Nauvoo, or in that area, this guy by the name of Parley Pratt. Now, Parley Pratt was a leading Mormon figure back in the Nauvoo area. And he had a number of wives, and all of a sudden he got the hots for somebody else's wife, a non-Mormon, and ran off with her. And well, this guy didn't take that too kindly. He hunted Parley Pratt down and shot him. So that created a little bad blood between the non-Mormons and the Mormons. Well, that story, of course, got translated or brought back out to Salt Lake. And during that time, the Mormons had a group of vigilantes they called the Danites. And the Danites, what they would do, anybody that became an apostate or did something that Brigham Young or Joseph Smith before Brigham Young, if they did something that was out of line with church orders or church directions and customs, they would go give them an attitude adjustment, give them a talking to. And if the talking to didn't work, they'd just cut their throat. They'd kill them. There's a lot of history behind that. I'm not just making that stuff up. So anyway, when this wagon train from Arkansas makes it out to Salt Lake Valley, and they find out that a lot of the people are from Missouri and Arkansas. There's a bit of bad blood there. And so Brigham wasn't sure what to do about it, and there's a bit of controversy as to how they decided to do what they did. But eventually, by the time that wagon train got all the way down to Mountain Meadows, and Mountain Meadows is kind of a launching place where the wagon trains would rest before taking off across the Arizona desert on their way to California. So as these guys were resting up in this, it's probably up around 7,000 feet. It's pretty high elevation, but it's real pretty. Probably wasn't too pretty in September, though. By the end of the summer, it's pretty dry and pretty desolate up there. I mean, we've been there in the springtime. You may have seen some of the pictures on our video here. That was in May. And it's very pretty. There's flowers and a little bit of water in some of the creeks. But by the end of the summer, there's probably no water anywhere to be found. So that's where they found themselves. So one of the Danites, or at least somebody that was influenced by the Danite tradition, this Mr. John D. Lee and a couple other church leaders, got some direction from headquarters up in Salt Lake that they needed to deal with these Arkies. And so they put together a plan. They tried to convince the Indians to go down and do away with these rebellious Arkies, but the Indians, they didn't do a very good job, so the Mormons had to help them out. And so eventually that's what happened. Everybody was killed except for about a dozen little kids. They wanted to kill anybody that was old enough to communicate or remember what had happened. So they kept just little toddlers. And of course there was a lot of little kids that were shot during the shootout because, I mean, it was an easy shoot for the Mormons. They'd just get up on the hills around this meadow and just start picking them off. So by the time the people from Arkansas figured out what was going on, there was already a number of their people had been wounded or killed. So that's kind of some of the history behind this shootout. Now, the Civil War, of course, was getting ramped up about this time too, so the U.S. government had its hands full. So it took a little while for them to try to figure out what had happened, and they sent some troops out there to try to sort it out and bring some people to justice. Well, the Mormon Church, of course, tried to cover it all up, and the only person that was ever brought to justice was John D. Lee, and they actually, I think they had to go all the way down to Lee's Ferry. Now, Lee's Ferry, what happened was John D. Lee went to Lee's Ferry, which is in the far eastern end of the Grand Canyon. And it's one of the few places where you can cross the river because there's cliffs every place else. But at this Lee's Landing, as they call it, there was a place where they could portage across. And so Lee, thinking that, sooner or later somebody's going to be after him because he was one of the leading culprits in this massacre, he decided to go to Lee's Landing and put together a ferry service to where he could make a living and support his 3 wives. And so that's what he did. And so the military, I'm sure they probably went to Cedar City first, trying to figure out what was going on, what the history was, and they had to figure out what to do with these little kids that had been orphaned. And of course there's a lot of Mormon families had taken them in out of desperation. Now this is a big deal because this was a wealthy wagon train. They had hundreds of cattle. They had a lot of guns, and I mean they were loaded. I mean they had a lot of money because to have a wagon train as big as they did on the way to California, it took some resources to pull off something like this. So it was a big deal for John D. Lee and these guys to get all this merchandise and get all these wagons and get all these cattle. And of course, they tried to cover all that stuff up. They made a lot of money out of the deal. The military eventually had to chase John D. Lee all the way to Lee's Ferry, which I've got some pictures I'll show you here that we've taken just recently. It's a very beautiful place. Lower elevation, obviously, than Mountain Meadows. Red rock, lots of cliffs, and that's where they finally caught up with him. And then they took him all the way back to Mountain Meadows, and it's well over 100 miles. So these guys went down there to get him, and then brought him back. All this is on horseback. So can you imagine how much work that must have been? And I think it was early in the spring when they finally brought him back, and he sat on the casket that they had brought for the occasion. They took some pictures, and he made some final statements. He never did renounce Joseph Smith or the gospel, or at least his version of the gospel, but he did speak out against Brigham Young. He thought Brigham Young was, wasn't too fair with him, making him a scapegoat, basically, because nobody else was going to step up. There was one person, I forget what the guy's name was, that went state evidence against John D. Lee and some of the others. But John D. Lee was the only one that was ever prosecuted. They shot him. You notice in this plaque that was put in here by the Mormon Church, there's no mention of the fact the Mormons are the ones that did the dirty deed. And originally, this is kind of a replica of the original pile of stones that the military built in honor of these guys that were killed here, 120 some odd people. But originally there was a cross on top. But the Mormons don't like crosses, so you can see there's no cross on top of this.
By the rivers of our beginning, where we learn to pray, there are words we can live by, they apply still today. Will we come home rejoicing, or will we come home at all, my Lord? My Lord, my Lord, my Lord, my Lord. Will we come home rejoicing, or will we come home at all, my Lord?